So welcome to the first lecture video on PLIN 0048, Foundations of Linguistics. In this video we'll be discussing the what, why and how of linguistics. However, before we get started, it's time for a couple of ground rules in this class. So there are two rules that are really important. The first rule is don't panic. The lectures that we have here are meant to give you a broad background so that you're informed about the debates and ideas behind linguistics and why we do it the way that we do it. And so you have a little bit of breadth, so you can put things in context that you learn on other modules and that you might not have the chance to explore there in so much depth. The tutorials that you're doing are meant to help you develop your skills. So, it might be that you're already a wizard with Word and there isn't that much, so you can, improve that maybe just a slight bit. It might also be that you've never really bothered trying out all the things that we're going to try out in the tutorial. But don't worry about where you end up or where you're starting from. This is just about enabling you to be a better linguist and to better succeed in your other linguistic endeavors. So I would urge you to focus on understanding and appreciating the broader issues that we're discussing here and the broader kind of aspects and skills that we're trying to teach you. There's no expectation that you would understand and remember every detail and great depth of what we're discussing. Often in the lectures we'll be going in much more depth than you will possibly remember, and sometimes students panic because they think, oh my god, I have to remember all of this, I have to understand the reading, and they feel like they're really out of their depth. Don't panic. You're not meant to understand and remember every detail, and it's not meant to give you really deep grounding. Of course, if you find some topic throughout the next 10 weeks that you find really fascinating and want to read more on and find out more about, that's fantastic, and go ahead. But don't worry if there are a couple of things that you struggle to get a hang of. Of course, in the Q&As and the lectures and our interactions and tutorials, we'll try and get you to the best point we can, but it's not like other modules where you have to remember all of the nitty-gritty detail. And lastly, an important thing to point out is a lot of people on this module come from very different starting points. Some people have done degrees where they've done a lot of science. Some people have done degrees where they've done a lot of languages. Some have even done a little bit of linguistics before. So invariably, if you try and compare yourself to your classmates, you will find that you feel like you're left out, or you're not catching on as well, and so on. And that's really not the right way to compare yourself, especially on this module. On this module, if you want to compare yourself and you feel that urge, compare yourself to yourself. Think about, well, where did I start and how did I grow? And if at the end of this module you can say, well, yes, I'm more well-rounded and I have a broader background and a wider understanding of the implications and the practice of linguistics and how I go about things doing, and my skills are better, well, then you've succeeded and you've achieved everything that you needed to achieve. Now, the second rule, and it's almost a little bit more important than that first rule. The second rule is to always remember rule number 1. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, let's get to the what, why, and how of linguistics. So what is linguistics anyways? If you went to a dictionary and you looked up linguistics, you might find something like this. Linguistics, noun, the scientific study of language. All right, good, fair enough, but what does that mean? There are a number of questions that we can ask to unpack that statement. Well, first of all, what aspects of language are we interested in? Are we interested in poetry that maybe rhymes and maybe free verse that doesn't rhyme and has no fixed meter? Or are we interested in some other aspect, perhaps the possible variations of grammar or of word order across languages? And why should that matter? Why should whatever we study about language be important to us? We also crucially have to ask, well, whatever it is that we're studying, and however important it might be, how are we best going about studying that? Well, in the definition it already says we're studying scientifically, but what does that mean to study something scientifically? So those are all questions we're going to try and answer a little bit today. So let's start with the question of what aspects of language we as linguists are interested in. Well, the principal thing that we're interested in is the mental knowledge that speaker-hearers have about a language, specifically about the languages that they know. We then also ask a lot of ancillary questions that really have a bearing on that question ultimately. For example, how is that knowledge acquired? How does it happen that some fetus, even before it's born, acquires some knowledge about the language that its mother speaks? And then within just a couple of years of being born, without explicitly ever being taught, perfectly acquires its native language. When, even a trained linguist like I can take language classes for years on end and I still struggle. So how is it that children master this so perfectly? How do they come by the knowledge that they have? We might ask, well, how do people make use of that knowledge, right? So whatever they have stored in their mind, it's not just a thing that they walk around with, but, well, of course, language is interactive. Language is something that we use to communicate, to convey meaning. I have an idea in my mind, I'm going to put that idea in your mind. And then we will ask questions such as, well, now that we know that knowledge, how is that knowledge actually represented in the speaker's mind? Right? It turns out that you don't just, willy-nilly memorize, the sound of words and then try and reproduce that, but rather the mind is a little bit selective in what it stores and what it doesn't, because it doesn't need to remember everything. Some things it can just compute on the fly, for example. And then ultimately you might also ask, how that mental knowledge is implemented in the brain, neurologically, right? On the level of neurons. How does that happen? So those are all questions that linguists ask, but they all hark back to that one initial question: what is it that a speaker knows about their language? Right, so why does linguistics matter? Why should we try and answer those questions? Well, linguistics is a cognitive science. Cognitive science means it's a science about how the mind stores and produces information. So it really helps us to understand how the human mind works. The mind being what the brain does, as Steven Pinker puts it very aptly. So it helps us understand, ultimately, humans and the entirety of humanity. Take the perspective of a biologist. And in principle, you could say that linguists are very highly specialized biologists. A biologist tries to understand, if they're working on a specific species of animals, how that animal works, what defines that animal, what makes it different from other species, how do the various things the various capabilities or faculties, as we will come to call them later, that this animal possesses, how do they work? And that's exactly what we're doing. We're looking at one very specific faculty of the human mind, which is a part, of course, of, the human brain, which is a part of human nature, of human biology, right, which is a part of the larger biology of the animal kingdom, and so on. So, in a way, we're getting a lot of understanding about humans and humanity. And of course, as everyone knows, language is a really, really important part of our culture, our society, of what defines us as human. A lot of the time people will say, and even though there's a lot of debate about this, whatever sets humans apart from the rest of the animal kingdom ultimately boils down to this communicative ability that we have, language. That's what allowed us probably to so rapidly take over the world, as it were. So ultimately, it also helps us understand the world, because humans, have a lot of impact on the world, and communication and language, and the way that language shapes all of that is an immensely important part of that. On the other hand, you can just say, well, as a natural phenomenon, language occurs in nature, and that is part that we seek to understand about the world, so by studying that, we gain an understanding about this little area of the world where there is this naturally occurring phenomenon that is language. And in actuality, acquiring all this knowledge and learning about all of this might also help us to change the world for the better or for the worse. I will not tell you how you can use linguistics for evil, but there are many ways that you can use linguistics for good also. For example, if you find out how language planning works and how the sounds are produced and planned and stored in a speaker's mind, you might gain a lot of understanding about, for example, people that suffer from stuttering. And you might then be able to, based on that, develop therapeutic approaches that are more efficient than approaches that we have now that can help people with stuttering. So there are lots and lots of applications that the study of language has. Other things that, of course, you're all familiar with are things like, take out your phone and say hi to whoever's on there, Google, say hi to Alexa, say hi to Siri. There's a lot of, in that engineering sphere, there's a lot of knowledge that they take from linguists like us to make these things work. So how do linguists study language, or more specifically perhaps, how do linguists study the knowledge of language that speakers carry around in their mind-brain? Well, linguists do a lot of things to acquire knowledge about the knowledge of language. They ask a lot of questions, like, how is it that an English speaker knows that if I make the plural of cats, I have a voiceless S at the end, cats. And if I make the plural of dogs, I get a voiced sibilant sound, z, at the end. What conventionally you spell with an S is the voiceless one on cats, and what conventionally you would spell with a Z is actually the one that you find on dogs. However, in English spelling, we don't show that difference. But speakers know that. So you might ask, for example, well, how come that they know that and they're able to do that? We make a lot of observations. Data is king, and linguistics is an empirical science. So we go around in the world and we look what's there, because then we can make theories about how those things work. So we might convey direct observations, where we go and we look at data sets, or we look at recorded speech and the sort of things that people do. The opportunities for indirect observations, so we can draw inferences, for example, from other things that we see about things that we can't directly see. A lot of neuroscientific methods rely on indirect observations. For example, when you do EEG and you put a lot of electrodes in people's heads and you measure sort of the electrical impulses that hurry around the skull, or really the scalp, the outside of the skin that covers your head. Well, that's an indirect observation of what's happening in the brain. right? So something's happening in the brain, and that has some effect on the electrical stimulation that's happening even outside on top of your scalp, and that you can measure, and then you can draw inferences from that about what's actually happening when the brain, the mind, are processing information. We also use introspective observations. So as humans that know a language, sometimes we can draw on ourselves and on our own knowledge to find something out about language. We can ask ourselves, if the plural of cats is cats and the plural of dog is dogs, what would be the plural of a word like flag? Could it be flags? No, it couldn't be. Right? That's a judgment I can make. And so sometimes by just sort of introspecting how I feel about things, and it's a bit more fine-grained when you get into detail of it, we can also make observations that are valid about language. We use a lot of reasoning, of course, inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning. You'll learn about that a little bit later on in more detail, but you're probably already doing it a lot and you know a lot about it. We make hypotheses, right? We make educated guesses based on how we think the world is, what should happen about something that we don't know yet. And of course we're in the business of making theories and of modeling the world. Right? When we make a theory, we're making a model of what we think the world is like, and then we can ask questions of that model. We can ask, well, if this is how the world is like, and here are the rules that we came up with of how we think it works, then, in some area that we don't have knowledge about, what does that say about that? And then we can go and check whether that's true. That's essentially sort of how scientific methods work. And we'll have a whole another video on that in a moment. And then, of course, we're integrating a lot of results. Right? A lot of linguistics is looking what other people have done, what different theories say, looking at different sets of data, looking at evidence even that comes from other fields. So you might be looking at evidence that comes from neuroscience, evidence that comes from biology, at evidence that's coming out of psychological studies. You might be looking at various sources of evidence and trying to integrate them, because ultimately our theories have to fit together. Right? We're looking for one grand unified theory, just like every physicist in the world. But a thing that you have to keep in mind is we're not just going around and doing all these things randomly. Well, we have a very systematic way of going about them, and that's using the scientific method, which we will talk about a little bit more shortly. Just before we move on, there is an important distinction that we have to make to sort of clarify, what aspect we're interested in when we say we're interested in mental knowledge the speaker has. And so we call that the competence versus performance distinction. So competence we define as the mental knowledge that a speaker-hearer has about their language. So whatever is stored in their mind. And that is quite different from the ability to perform based on that knowledge. So performance is defined as the ability of a speaker to put that knowledge to use. So as you can see in my rather poor drawing abilities here, a good way to remember this is competence is what you have in your head, and performance is what comes out of your mouth. And you'll find a lot of the time, as you probably have already noticed in the 15-20 minutes that I've been talking, I've been making quite a lot of errors that I have not been making consistently, for example. I've stuttered every now and then, I'm hesitating, I have difficulties finding my words, and that's something that you probably know from yourself as well. That doesn't mean that I don't know the grammar, it doesn't mean that I don't know how to pronounce a word, but sometimes I might just get it wrong. And so if I'm interested in the mental knowledge that a speaker has, I want to filter out the effects of imperfect performance, of the circumstances under which that knowledge is performed. And so that is quite an important distinction to keep in mind as you delve further into the business of linguistics. So let's sum up what we've just talked about. Well, what did we say about the what of linguistics? Well, linguists study languages as a property of the human mind. Linguistics is a cognitive science. So the approach that we take is that of someone who tries to understand how the mind and the brain processes and stores information. Part of the biology of humans, if you will. Why do we do that? Well, language is a window onto the human mind. It's a great opportunity. It's one of the few things that is readily externalized, that we can readily introspect about, that we can readily experiment with, that happens in the human mind. So it's a really, really important tool in understanding human cognition. And it can tell us a lot about how the human mind works. And as I've said before, of course, linguistic insight can inform many other areas of inquiry. So it might inform inquiry in the medical, pathological domain. It might inform inquiry about why society is the way it is. In sociology, right, it tells you a lot about sort of group identity and effects like that. It can tell you a lot about the psychology of humans. The many, many areas where linguistics can inform other areas. Computer science, think of Alexa, of Siri, and so on. How do we do linguistics? Well, we use scientific method. And I have now, this was not a performance issue, I have on purpose left out the definite article. And if you want to find out why, well then head on over to the next video. I'll see you there.